In our first reading, we heard the last of 6 of what we call the Confessions of Jeremiah. There are first-person poems where Jeremiah speaks from his heart to God, and in a few of them, God responds to him. Well, in the part that we heard today, Jeremiah, he's in a place of desolation. He's come to realize that his life is one of pain and suffering. He's a prophet of God, yet in the very act of doing God's will, prophesying, he suffers persecution and misunderstandings, and he even has his friends turn against him. And it can seem unfair when we do God's will and we suffer more than those that don't. But a question we could ask ourselves in the spiritual life is, what is it that we desire? Jeremiah, he suffered all these things, but at the same time, he was filled with a burning desire to preach and speak the truth. Teresa of Avila, she once said that we should love God without any motive of self-interest, and that in prayer and service to God, we should desire to suffer and to imitate the Lord, not to receive consolations. The first and greatest desire we should be bringing to prayer is the desire to imitate Christ, particularly in his suffering. In our gospel today, Christ, he's sending his disciples out on their first mission, but before they go, he gives them instructions. And part of these instructions, which we actually didn't hear today, it's just after the gospel, but part of these instructions, he says, "He who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me." Now, when we think of a cross, we don't normally think comfort. We think difficulty and we think suffering. The world today, it's kind of softened us to this idea of suffering. With all the advertisements and emphasis on wealth, it convinces us that we should seek comfort in this life. We should live a comfortable life and then one day peacefully pass away in that comfort. But Jesus, he challenges us to do something different. Don't seek comfort, but what he tells us in the dark, utter in the light. And what we hear whispered, proclaim it upon the housetops. In a word, I'd say that Jesus is really challenging us to be countercultural, and that brings with it a certain degree of suffering because we're going against the grain, what the world tells us. But if you think of someone who goes up on a rooftop or a housetop to yell something to others, that person, if they're not crazy, is usually pretty convinced in what they're saying. They're excited about it. They believe in it, and they're fully convinced of what they're saying. St. Anthony of Padua, I think he's a pretty good example of this. He was a very well-learned man, and he was a good preacher. He traveled one day to a town in Italy. It was called Rimini, and there were a lot of heretics in this town. And the leaders of the town told the people there to ignore Anthony when he came. And that's what they did. Anthony would preach, and he was met with silence. And this really bothered him. And so one day, he was walking outside the town along the river, and he saw some fish in the river. And he began to preach to the fish, because the fish were the only ones that would listen to him. And before long, thousands of fish had gathered around to listen to Anthony preach. And the townspeople, they were so moved by this miracle that they were willing to listen to Anthony, and then a lot of them ended up converting because of that. Now, whether this is historically accurate or not, I'm not sure. But as I said, St. Anthony, he was a very well-learned man, and he was an excellent preacher. And kind of as proof to this fact is, if you've ever been over to Padua in Italy, Anthony, once he died, he was buried there. And when they exhumed his body, his whole body had decomposed, but his tongue was incorrupt. And so you can still travel over there, and his jaw and his tongue are kept in a reliquary over there. It's a really cool thing. It's Catholic. So Anthony, he's a very good preacher, and but he encountered a lot of difficulties, just like the prophets. But he didn't let this stop him. He persevered despite the difficulties because he was fully convinced in what he had to say. Now, if we think about it, there's a lot of voices in our world today, and it seems like it's usually the ones who have it wrong, the ones who promote sinful lifestyles and beliefs that are fully convinced of what they have to say. And their rooftop is social media in the news. and their voice is loud. The Christians, kind of on the other end of the spectrum, usually we kind of remain on the sidelines. We like to live that quiet, peaceful, and comfortable existence and try not to upset too many people. But as Christians, as followers of Christ, we have the most right to speak because what we preach by word and example is the truth. It's Jesus Christ. And we should be excited about this. We should be excited about our faith. And that excitement is something that should grow over time as we learn more about our faith through reading and studying, and as we grow in our prayer life, and even just in our daily life, as we grow in our prayer life, we begin to become more aware of Christ working in our life, and we start to see all the connections between our faith and just what seems like the regular and mundane. And it gets very exciting when you see Christ always present, working through us and through others. But as Christians, we all have a duty to continue to grow and live our faith, to speak about it and pass it on to others. St. Paul, he reminds us in our second reading that we were once modeled off of or conformed to the old Adam. We were born into this world as slaves to sin. But now, all of us, because of baptism, we take after the new Adam. We're conformed to the new Adam, which is Jesus Christ. We've become adopted children of God. And this new identity that we receive from Christ, it has with it the responsibility of representing Christ in the world. And this isn't without its difficulties. If the prophets, if the disciples, if the saints, all those closest to God in life encounter difficulties, then it's guaranteed that we will too. But we shouldn't be fearful, and we shouldn't let fear cripple us, because in our gospel, our Lord gives us hope. He tells us that He cares for us. He says that every hair on our head is known to Him. And in a strange way, and I would say perhaps in the greatest way, He shows this care for us by allowing us to suffer. When He allows us to go through difficulty, misunderstanding, and even abandonment, those moments in our spiritual life where we feel like God's not with us anymore, He's just distant from us and He doesn't hear us at all. Well, in those moments of suffering, that's when we're purified, and He gives us a chance through that suffering to participate more fully in His life and in His sufferings.